Hello, world. I'm Dr. Kat Braybrooke, and today I want to talk about how we can rethink the role of creativity in digital environments in a crisis. I also want to explore how we can respond to the needs of the current moment through collective action in ways that enable hacks or alternatives in the status quo to emerge. I'm going to argue that these alternatives can take the form of collective spaces that we ourselves build, which can become sites of mutual aid, learning, and transformation. I am a digital anthropologist and a designer who studies the critical dynamics of creative communities across virtual and physical terrains, from hackers to crafters. In particular, I look at how collective spaces, from museums to libraries to makerspaces, can harness cultural heritage in ways that foster social and ecological transformation. I am currently a research fellow with the Creatures Project at the University of Sussex in the UK, which examines how creative practices can foster sustainable development, and a visiting researcher at the King's College London Department of Digital Humanities, where I've joined a rapid response team of researchers in London and Tokyo who will be prototyping alternative cultural experiences for the isolated and vulnerable. I have also studied the gender subjectivities of female hackers in free software, and the experiences of people who were involved in the first spaces for digital making and learning inside museums in the UK, like Tate and the British Museum, which I've called collection makerspaces. I also build collective spaces from community festivals to digital platforms like the COVID Creatives Toolkit, which I'll discuss with you today. As a result of all of this, I've spent quite a lot of time thinking about the many challenges of setting up collective spaces on and off the web, and how the materiality of our physical relations in what is called meat space or the real world can be replicated in digital terrains. In thinking about this, I find it really helpful to recall the lessons of the internet's earliest MMPORGs of the 1980s and 1990s, also known as massively multiplayer online role-playing games. These were collective digital spaces that existed entirely in conceptual realms, embodied through code, databases, and thoughts alone. Despite these constraints, they mattered deeply to people and impacted on their daily lives in much the same way as their IRL encounters. Lambda Mu, for example, was an MUD, or a multi-user dimension, that was popular on the web in the 1990s. For those who were involved in it, it was a site of both resistance and transformation. By transforming themselves into whoever they wanted to be, its users also transformed their own spatial realities, at least while they were logged in. In this, Lambda Mu was not so different from today's virtual communities, from VR chat to Animal Crossing. Where it was different, however, was in the ways that its architectures were constructed, because instead of materializing through a VR headset or a screen, the beings of Lambda Mu and the spaces they built for themselves existed only through text. Here's a description of what Mu felt like from the journalist Julian Dibble, who in 1993 wrote one of the most famous accounts of that world and how it came to be his second home. A good many months ago, let's say about halfway between the first time you had heard the words information superhighway and the first time you wished you never had, I found myself tripping now and then down the well-traveled information lane that leads to Lambda Mu, a very large and very busy rustic mansion built entirely of words. On the occasional free evening in my New York City apartment, I'd sit down and type the commands that called those words onto my computer screen, dropping me with what seemed like a warm electric thud inside the house's darkened coat closet, where I checked my quoted-in identity, stepped into the persona and appearance of a minor character from a long-gone television sitcom, and stepped out into the glaring chatter of the crowded living room. Sometimes when the mood struck me, I emerged as a dolphin instead, on the brink of a future in which human existence may find itself as tightly enveloped in digital environments as it is today in the architectural kind. My point in sharing Lambda Mu with you is that all of the terrains that we walk through in our lives have an impact on us one way or another, whether that walk happens to be physical, virtual, or only in the mind. This means that we are always in the business of building collective worlds, whether we realize it or not. These worlds may manifest as a carefully constructed digital farm, as an exchange of texts, or as a community book club, but within them there are always opportunities to suggest more utopian alternatives. The science fiction author Kim Stanley Robinson has argued that our encounters with global crises, where a new world order emerges, however temporary, sound familiar, act as catalysts and rewire our imaginations for good. Our quarantine encounters in this time of pandemic are impacting on each of us in ways that we are only beginning to understand. They are also showing us what's possible, but the future still feels uncertain. For this reason, the question that remains most prominent in my mind is how the collective experience of this virus can foster collective action. How can the current moment enable new environments for learning, reflection, and rebuilding to emerge that not only replicate what's come before, but instead experiment with new ways of being? These are the kinds of questions that consumed my attention as COVID-19 descended upon us. The more I spoke to the creative practitioners I work with, from artists, makers, and designers, to hackers, curators, and educators, the more I realized just how hard hit so many of them would be by the persistent uncertainties of the virus. This is because those with precarious livelihoods are currently faced with two emergencies at once. The first, a health crisis, and the second, economic instability. The data on this is already worrying. With arts and cultural institutions from Egypt to Asia having had to close their doors and furlough staff for months, many of them are now under significant threat of permanent closure. And over 60% of makers surveyed by the Craft Council in the UK earlier this month have reported a loss of income of over £5,000 in the next 6 months alone. In the United States, a census of freelance art workers by Art Handler has found that 90% do not have paid leave, and 80% are very worried about rent. A report by the Fair Work Foundation, meanwhile, indicates that half of the world's estimated 50 million gig workers have already lost their jobs, and we are seeing creatives across all sectors worldwide stating that they lack access to the support they need to navigate what's ahead. The COVID Creatives Toolkit emerged from these uncertainties as a mutual aid effort on a Google Doc aimed at offering some of that much needed support by helping creative practitioners who found themselves needing to quickly migrate their practice onto digital environments as a result of the virus. My collaborators and I noticed that many of the kits, guides, and other resources that were being populated for creatives were geographically skewed towards North American perspectives, or did not allow external contributions. For these reasons, we wanted to offer an open resource focused on free offerings with a global reach, which could be maintained by creatives themselves. Starting from an open call on the web asking for help, we were soon joined by over 30 artists, makers, and curators around the world who helped compile its content. While the toolkit does have its issues, like many other collective spaces hosted on proprietary platforms, it has become a kind of a living archive of the pandemic and its impacts on creative practices. Like Lambda Mu, the toolkit exists mostly through text alone, but in moving through it, a reader nevertheless experiences a bit of a shock, a sense of the collective feelings of the moment. Its contributors started by suggesting digital gatherings aimed at challenging social isolation, such as Anti-Universities, the Ouroboros Festival, and the Disruptive Fridays series, and soon moved on to educational opportunities, meditative browser extensions, and digital well-being options. The kit now has 8 categories, from digital gathering spaces to digital tools for creation and support to digital well-being, which have offered us with an ongoing record of the resources that creatives are most in need of. Chapter 8, for example, was initially suggested by an anonymous contributor, and it now features some much needed data points on how COVID is impacting creatives around the world. Another primary focus of the kit has become resources on bargaining for collective rights, with contributions from the UVW Designers and Cultural Workers Union and many others. In many ways, this toolkit also became a collective space of care for many of us who were involved in it, because in a period of extreme uncertainty, it offered us something to actually co-create. The design fusionist Cassia Moga, who was one of the toolkit's curators with me, has explained it this way. It is such a strange time for everyone, she says, and some people might be able to cope with this lockdown and anxiety better than others. Digital creatives are fluent in using network tech to feel connected, but in many cases there is a need to still have an anchor or a routine to keep grounded, especially while the ground is shifting, and to have a strong base to continue to be creative from. I believe this is what the COVID Creatives Toolkit has provided, a resource for everyone to feel anchored. Perhaps this is the answer to my earlier question about how to evolve beyond collective paralysis in periods of crisis. Is it possible that collective action can emerge through something as simple as creative participation, where groups come together to identify what's needed and build collective spaces that react to those needs with care in mind? For the groups involved in the Lambda Mu, the collective experience ended up being a temporary one, only lasting as long as those who had helped construct its society. Despite this, it left a trace on its participants that lasted long beyond the brick and mortar of its source code. Julian Dibble has written about how he waited around for many months for a missing character named Dr. Jest to return to the virtual society. Wherever he'd gone, Dibble wrote, he had left behind a room that he'd created for himself. A treehouse very tastefully decorated with rare bookshelves, an operating table, and a life-size William S. Burroughs doll, and he left it unlocked. So I took to checking in there occasionally, heading out of my own cozy nook inside a TV set, inside the Little Red Hotel, inside the Monopoly board, inside the dining room of Lambda Mu, and teleporting on over to the treehouse, where the room description always told me that Dr. Jest was still asleep. My point here is that it doesn't really matter if the spaces we build are based in virtual or physical terrains. What matters is that they matter to those who interact with them. For this reason, my advice for those who want to construct new digital environments for co-learning and co-creation is to be extremely intentional about the kind of impacts you want to have. Knowing this, you can choose to replicate the hierarchies of a traditional classroom, for example, or you can use that opportunity to build something very different. You can speak to groups that offer alternative and self-organized education and learn how they have done things, and use those findings to challenge the very institutions that you are involved in by building digital learning environments that are more experimental, more open, and more participatory than those that came before them. I would say that publicly engaged webinars like this one show us how these new ways can be possible. This March from a Paris under lockdown, the philosopher Bruno Latour wrote about the importance of facing this pandemic by rethinking how we all arrived at it in the first place. It is right now that we have to fight, he argues, so that the economic recovery, once the crisis has passed, does not bring back the same former climatic regime against which we were battling, until now somewhat in vain. In actuality, the health crisis is not embedded in a transitory crisis that is passing, but in an ongoing and irreversible ecological mutation. If we are lucky enough to come out of the first, there is no chance we will come out of the second. And it would be a pity not to use this health crisis to discover other means of entering the ecological mutation without a blindfold on. With these points in mind, I want to end this talk by emphasizing the value of thinking about the collective spaces we build for digital terrains as experiments in collective adaptation, which involves both an adaptation to the circumstances and limitations of our society, and also an opportunity to think about how the institutions that make up that society, our museums, our libraries, our schools, our governments, and our community centers work, and how we can help them to work differently. As we are being shown again and again by pandemics like Ebola and COVID, which emerge only when we exploit our world's wild places for economic benefit. We simply cannot proceed with business as usual. So let's hack it and let's rebuild things differently. Thank you for listening.